welcome everybody. I think it's probably time that we got started. We're going to, of course, be hearing about cognitive ageing and work, implications for organisations and an ageing workforce. My name is Alison Williams. I'm a researcher with CEPAR in Stream 3, which is to do with mature workers and organisations. And I'm here to introduce Dr. Gwenith, who's going to be delivering the lecture today. But first, I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land of elders past and present on which this meeting takes place. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence in Population and Ageing Research, and I can see some of you are already, we are a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional research program, and we draw on the expertise of all sorts of different disciplines to find some of the answers to one of the biggest demographic challenge of the 21st century, which is, of course, the ageing population. And there's currently 4 research streams. Just quickly list those for you. There's macro demographic dynamics. There's also researchers who are looking into decision making, expectations and cognition. Then there's my own research stream, which is organisations and the mature workforce. And the fourth stream is sustainable wellbeing in later life. So in our own research stream, we have just finished data collection for a very big research, our first big research project, which is a benchmark survey of mature workers in Australia. And we're very excited about finally collecting some data. It's all coming in, almost finished, and we're looking forward to forming a picture of this group of workers in 2019. So now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gwen Fisher, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology at Colorado State University. She's Adjunct Associate Professor in the Colorado School of Public Health, Adjunct Associate Research Professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, and of course she is also an Associate Investigator for us here at CEPAR. Gwen obtained her BA in Psychology at Penn State University, and she has an MA and PhD in Industrial and Organisational Psychology from Bowling Green State University in Ohio in the USA. Her research investigates individual and work-related factors relevant to environmental and occupational health and worker well-being. And in particular, she conducts research that focuses on ageing workers, retirement, issues relating to work and non-work, and parental leave. Gwen directs the doctoral program in Industrial and Organisational Psychology at Colorado State University and the NIOSH Mountain and Plains Education and Research Centre Occupational Health Psychology Training Program. So today, Gwen is going to be presenting to us on work and retirement trends, ageing and cognitive functioning, implications of ageing and cognitive functioning for work and for human resources management. These are all, I think, very important and quite deep topics that we all want to know more about. She'll also be discussing the research, practical and policy implications for the labour force at societal, organisational and individual levels. So, please welcome Dr. Gwen Fisher.
Thank you so much for the kind and wonderful introduction, Alison. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of you taking time out of your day, your evening to come be here this evening. And before I get started, how many of you have thought about your own retirement? Okay, does anyone here know when you might retire? Okay, all right. So some people have, it seems like many of you have thought about it. One person has a good sense, and For the rest of us, it might be a little bit up in the air. I'm going to be talking about retirement and cognition and so forth today, but it just helps me to understand a bit. Before I really get going here, I really want to thank many people and places without whose support the work that I'll be presenting today wouldn't be possible, and my being here with all of you wouldn't be possible. Most importantly, I want to thank CEPAR and folks at the center for the funding which supported my trip from Colorado to Australia. I feel incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to be with you. And I also just spent the last 2 weeks in Perth working with researchers, Sharon Parker and her team at Curtin University as well on some projects that I'll be talking about today just a little bit. The Center for Transformative Work Design also helped to support the trip, and I'm grateful for the opportunities to collaborate with them. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States houses our National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which funds many of our graduate students in our occupational health psychology training program at Colorado State. And many of the research that many of the papers that I've been fortunate to publish was with the help of my graduate students and my doctoral students, and this was the group that funded them as well. And then the research I'll be presenting was supported with grants from the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute on Aging, which is also the organization that funds the health and retirement study about which I'll be talking today, and also work that I did funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in the United States. And finally, the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research, where I was employed for 12 years following graduate school, and also where I learned about the health and retirement study and was fortunate to have wonderful colleagues, access to an amazing data set, and really just try to build and grow my career. And it was there that I learned about and developed a passion for issues with the aging workforce and recognizing how important it is. There are a number of individuals that I would like to thank and acknowledge as well. First and foremost, Dr. Sharon Parker at Curtin University, MK Ward and Gigi Petery, who are two of the research fellows there. Dory Chaffee is one of my graduate students at Colorado State University, who is, probably home sleeping right now, but otherwise busy working on her dissertation to finish her PhD. My colleagues Alyssa McGonigal, Lindsay Ryan, Amanda Soniga, Margaret Beyer, and Jackie Torres. The last study I'll be sharing with you today is based on a brand new paper that I was fortunate to work on with Margaret and Jackie. So first, I'm going to be talking about why it's important to study older workers. You may already know this or have some ideas about it, but I'll give you my perspective on that issue. Secondly, to talk about how work is related to health and well-being among older workers. Third, what can we do to design the work environment in a very preventive capacity? A lot of models in public health talk about preventive health measures and catching issues before they become problems. And so what can we do to design work so that we can make it a great place, not only for older workers, but for all workers, irregardless of age, especially with regard to health and well-being? And then finally, what are some recommendations for future research and practice? So why study older workers? One important reason is that there are changing workforce demographics. As you may very well be aware, globally, our workforce has been changing due to longevity, people living longer, healthier lives until much later ages than in the past. There are many people who, with living longer, tend to remain engaged in the workforce longer. And as the workforce is aging, we have a larger proportion of older workers that are in the workforce than ever before. And we're really seeing this globally in a lot of countries, including the United States, I believe here in Australia, a number of places in Europe. There are also a lot of public policy initiatives to change ages for accessing public pension benefits. Here in Australia, it's the superannuation. In the United States, it's our Social Security program. But countries like Germany and Italy and others have been increasing ages for retirement. In the United States, we've moved away from companies providing a pension based on age and years of service, but rather, similar to what happens here, providing a portion of money that goes into a fund, and then, and in our case, the longer we work, the more we have an opportunity to accrue funds rather than retiring and drawing from our savings. And so our government is creating a lot of economic incentives for people to remain in the workforce. So whether we see the glass as half empty or half full here, I'm not sure. The statistic is that in the United States, 18.2% of the U.S. population age 65 and older, and almost 8% age 70 and older are in the labor force. And I was recently at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California, presenting to a bunch of economists and presenting this exact statistic and saying we have a larger proportion of older workers. And they said, that's not a lot of people. That's only 18% or 8%, depending on the age range. And so my response to that is yes, however, it's on an upward trend. In other words, those percentages are much larger than what we saw a couple decades ago or even into the 1980s and early 90s when there was a trend toward earlier retirement. That trend seems to have shifted, except for a few people among the wealthiest who afford the opportunity to leave work at earlier ages. And as I spoke with a couple of people before the presentation this evening, we were talking about retirement, and if people have, on average, a longer life expectancy, retiring too soon gives you so much time, not that you can't fill that time or remain engaged or productive, but it's a long time of doing things other than being involved in the labor force. And we know from lots of prior research that there are benefits to continuing to work, remaining cognitively engaged, remaining, in some cases, physically active, although there are some downsides to some super physically demanding jobs. Remaining socially engaged is a critically important part of our well-being in later life, and just having things to do. So, as I just indicated, our retirement age is increasing, and there are a whole host of factors related to the timing of retirement. And importantly, it used to be that individuals would grow up, they would, when they became adults, join the labor force, work for a career, oftentimes maybe in one organization or with very few job changes during that career, and then decide at some point to retire, and that was it. And for some people, that may still be the pattern. They may change jobs a few more times in there, but at some point reach a point when they decide for them, or due to health circumstances, unfortunately, sometimes people don't have the choice. They need to retire due to their health or some other circumstance, or due to elder care responsibilities, needing to care for a spouse or a family member when it no longer works to remain in the labor force. But there are other retirement patterns that seem to be more dominant. One of the terms used in the organizational psychology literature is bridge employment, in which many people might leave a career and then go on to seek additional employment in other forms. Often people seek less demanding types of jobs. Maybe they don't want to work as many hours, or maybe it's a job that has other expectations. Are any of you familiar with the term bridge employment? Is that something you've heard before? Okay. And so we're just seeing that the proportion of individuals who opt for this less historically traditional pattern of retirement is indeed increasing. And then there's another phenomenon of which you may be familiar called job lock, and that is the notion that individuals may prefer to leave the labor force, but they perceive that they can't because they either need the wages, the income from employment, or in some cases other benefits such as health insurance in the United States. That's a huge one, because we don't have the good healthcare system that you have here. And 65 is the age at which individuals qualify for Medicare, which is a government insurance plan of sorts. And so people that might be eligible for their government retirement benefit at 62 but not have health insurance may be motivated economically to continue working until they're able to reach that point. And then there may be other benefits or other reasons as well. And so that leaves some people feeling stuck, in other words, locked in those jobs. So in short, this is all in summary to indicate that we're seeing, for a lot of reasons, a trend toward an older average retirement age, and that has implications for our health and well-being. In my research, I think of older adults as a special population, special in that it's important to study what's happening with the mature workforce for a number of reasons. And one issue that comes up is that as we get older, we're at a higher risk for chronic health conditions and functional impairment. I've now unfortunately reached an age where the prevalence of people having cancer, having heart disease, stroke, diabetes, those unfortunately are things that increase our, doesn't mean that because as we get older we're going to get those conditions, it just means that our risk or the likelihood may be higher when we also take into account genetics and lifestyle factors and so forth. And so what this does is it affects labor force participation, because some people may not have health that allows them to work, and it can impact their well-being. And there's simply a lot that we don't know because the workforce has been aging at a rate that is outpacing the extent to which we can keep up with it. So it's wonderful that CEPAR and folks here are doing this important work. And as I talked about in a paper with my student Dory, this has implications for work design, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the bulk of what I'm going to be speaking about is cognitive functioning and work. And when I refer to cognitive functioning, I'm talking about a variety of different mental abilities. It's not just one particular ability or IQ, if you're familiar with IQ, but rather a collection of all kinds of different abilities that allow us to reason, to solve problems, to learn things, to remember things, and to be able to make decisions, whether it's decisions, complex economic decisions of looking at whether we can afford to retire or not, or how to manage those resources, to all kinds of other things, as well as just our attention and our ability to stay focused on tasks. So cognitive functioning is important, first of all, because it's necessary for everyday functioning. I'm new to Sydney, got here for the first time last night, trying to navigate my way around the city, took off on a walk, and thankfully, I happen to have a map in my pocket, but it was my memory and my awareness that allowed me to find my way back. Memory to just remember to grab those apartment keys and stick them in my pocket before I'm locked out and unable to get there. Have you ever gone to a car park and then parked in a different spot and you're not sure, was that level 3, was that level 4? And when we park in different places every day, we can have an episodic memory failure in which, especially I know when I'm tired at the end of the day from work, I'll go to where I parked the car yesterday rather than where I parked today. So it's just those little things. And when we're focused on something else, maybe an emotional trigger, if we're on the phone or otherwise distracted, it becomes harder to remember those things than when we give our full attention to things. So I know that especially when I was packing for this trip, I had to be really, really mindful of what I was packing and what I was putting where, simply because if I'm doing that while having a conversation or getting interrupted 6 times by my children in the midst of all of that, then it's bad news and I can't remember where things are, and then my husband gets a bunch of text messages from me and then he gets frustrated. So in short, our cognition and our attention and memory is important for everyday functioning. It's especially important in the work environment. Can you think of a job for which you don't need to learn and remember things? Even our simpler, more basic jobs involve some degree of cognitive functioning. It's one of the reasons why in industrial organizational psychology, when we look for tools to use when hiring people, we can use cognitive ability tests because they're predictive of performance across all jobs. Some more than others, but in general, it's a generalizable tool. Rowe and Kahn also demonstrated that cognitive functioning is part of successful aging. The more we're able to maintain our faculties and be able to solve novel problems, the better off we'll be as we get older. One of the hallmarks of cognition is that it does change over time. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean there. But it does change, and so understanding age-related changes over the lifespan and how cognition changes in relation to experiences of different diseases and so forth is important. And also, cognitive functioning is tied in some ways to our physical health. Cardiovascular health conditions, such as heart disease and stroke and so forth, put us at risk for cognitive functioning issues. And diabetes as well. In other words, untreated hypertension and untreated diabetes are associated with much higher rates of cognitive impairment. So this particular graph shows cognitive abilities across the lifespan. First, I'd like you to look at the dotted line across the middle where it says traditional intelligence scores. So this is a graph showing changes over age in cognitive abilities, and for traditional intelligence test scores like IQ, we see that it peaks in young adulthood and then remains relatively stable over the life course. One of the reasons, again, why we can use cognitive ability tests in hiring people for jobs is because those tests they wouldn't necessarily lead to age discrimination because we don't see any kind of dip later on. But one of the challenges with those test scores is that it masks differences across the lifespan as a function of different types of cognitive abilities. So now I'd like to draw your attention to both the top line and the bottom line. The top line refers to crystallized intelligence. The bottom line is fluid cognitive abilities or fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, as you may know, refers to our knowledge and information we acquire through education and experience across our lifespan. We often assess crystallized intelligence through vocabulary and things that are likely to stick with us. If you've ever had a friend or family member experiencing cognitive decline, typically their vocabulary is one of the things they'll hang on to most. There may be other issues or conditions with being able to retrieve that information, but usually it's in there somewhere. What tends to go as we get older, so sorry if anyone here thought that no matter what we were on an upward trajectory across life. Hopefully it doesn't come, I hope I didn't ruin anyone's evening with this graph. That after early adulthood, there's a slow, somewhat steady decline in fluid cognitive abilities, and those are referred to reasoning, problem solving, and our ability to solve problems and issues in a novel context. There, many types of memory also fall into this particular category. And what we see is this gradual decline over the life course. And so what I'd like you to take away from this graph is first the fact that cognitive abilities do change over the lifespan, particularly with regard to our fluid cognitive abilities. And secondly, that it's important to assess multiple cognitive abilities if we want to differentiate between these different patterns, that if we just average everything together into an IQ score, we're losing the richness of how these things vary over age. Now switching to the work environment, job complexity refers, generally speaking, to the degree to which jobs and the tasks that people do in those jobs are either simple or complicated. So a job characterized as being more complex is going to be more complicated, involving many things, a lot more information processing, having to remember, make complex decisions, maybe jobs where doing a task involves multiple steps, versus a very simple job. I often think of a basic manufacturing environment in which people only have to put, one thing in one place and just do it repetitively. That would be a job that's not very cognitively complex. So the research question my colleagues and I sought to investigate was how job complexity relates to our cognitive functioning over time. And in particular, how does being involved in work that's characterized as being more complex relate to those patterns, the pattern in particular of fluid cognitive abilities where we would otherwise expect a decline. We wanted to know, does being involved in complex work help to serve as buffering the effect and the likelihood that our cognitive functioning is going to decline over age? Or does it buffer and protect us, or are we still at the same risk as everybody else if we're involved in not so complex work? So to answer this question, we investigated data from the Health and Retirement Study, which is an ongoing longitudinal study collected in the United States. It investigates health, retirement, and aging. The study began 27 years ago in 1992. There have been a total of 14 waves of data collected since then. Individuals are interviewed every 2 years, and all 14 waves of data are publicly available and online for the research community. The study is funded primarily by the U.S. National Institute on Aging, with a small bit of supplemental funding from the U.S. Social Security Administration. It's the largest social and behavioral sciences grant awarded by the National Institute on Aging, and it's on the magnitude of about $80 million every 6 years. So it's a pretty large effort. I was part of a team of about 50 in Michigan that worked on the study. And the sample size is, they survey between 17,000 to 20,000 people every 2 years in a nationally representative sample across the U.S. So the goal of the study is to create data for researchers to investigate so we can answer important scientific questions, as well as to address issues of relevance to public policy. The sample, as I indicated, is nationally representative of individuals 51 and older, and the sampling is done at the household level, so it also includes spouses or partners, regardless of age. The interviews are conducted via telephone or face-to-face. The proportion of face-to-face interviews, it used to be that it was baseline was face-to-face and follow-up interviews were over the telephone, unless somebody had a health or hearing issue that precluded phone interviews. But now, with the collection of biomarkers and a number of physiological and physical health measures, every other wave is done face-to-face, which that's part of the reason why it's so expensive. So the study includes all kinds of topics, everything from demographics and health status to a very detailed battery on economic status, labor force status and employment history, a bit about retirement and pensions, and family composition. So we use these data to look at cognitive functioning and work, and in particular, the job complexity. Theoretically, our research is framed by the use it or lose it hypothesis, thinking about our brain as a muscle and the notion that if we are active and cognitively engaged, we will use that muscle and we will then maintain our functioning. And if we do not use that, then we might experience some degree of atrophy or decline over time. And then there have been two other theories in the literature in cognitive aging and neurology. The brain or cognitive reserve hypothesis is a neurological comparative theory that I don't think really says a whole lot different than the use it or lose it hypothesis. It just refers to what's happening at the neuronal level and more in our brain structures. The notion that we have a cognitive reserve that we might build up or acquire through education and through genetics, that again, our brain is better able to withstand certain issues that come up if we have a better brain reserve. And then Schooler's work on environmental mechanisms talked about the benefit of education, the benefit of schooling and experience, and how exposure to those things has us better off for cognitive reasons. So in short, 3 different approaches that suggest that being involved in more complex work is likely to protect our cognitive functioning in later life. So we asked the question of whether individuals in jobs with higher mental demands will have higher levels of cognitive functioning and show slower rates of cognitive decline. And we compared that to those who were in jobs with less mental work demands. So we studied a little over 4,000 individuals in the health and retirement study. A key piece here was that we limited our analysis to those who were in the same type of work for at least 10 years, based on the notion that if people changed jobs or were not involved in work for at least 10 years, we were less certain about whether we would characterize their career or their job over a long period of time as being complex. To be very honest and truthful, the fact that we chose 10 years was a bit arbitrary. That was just where we thought it seemed like a reasonable cut point while maintaining a sufficiently large sample size for our statistical analysis. In this particular sample of people who began in the health and retirement study in 1992, on average, people were involved in the same type of work for 26 and a half years. So even if people did change jobs, they were likely to stay in the same occupation. So our cut point of 10 years was really far from what on average things looked like in the data set. The sample was about half men, half women, and 81% white or Caucasian, as we refer to them in the United States. The others were mostly African American or Black, and some small proportion of Latinos and Asians and folks from other areas. Our measures of cognitive functioning, I will talk about with an activity, hence the paper and pencil that I asked about, and then so it's a word task, and then we asked about mental work demands. Are any of you familiar with the Occupational Information Network, the ONET? Okay, I'm seeing some people nod and some people shake their heads. So to put everyone on the same page, it's a database developed by the Department of Labor in the United States that covers over 900 jobs, which is about, it's not every single job that exists, but it covers the majority. And data are collected by job incumbents and professional job analysts who are trained to evaluate occupations, and at the occupational level, describe the characteristics of the work that is required and the characteristics of the workers or who would take on those particular types of jobs. So of relevance to this particular study, there were questionnaires filled out where people had to answer 10 questions about the extent to which jobs involved information processing, decision making, creativity and creative thinking, and a whole number of different mental job demands. And then we controlled for years of education, socioeconomic status, health, depressive symptoms, and so forth. Okay, so now in terms of that piece of paper that hopefully you have in front of you, you don't have to put this in your notes if you're taking notes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a list of 10 words aloud. I would like you to not write them down as I read them. That kind of defeats the memory task that I'm going to give. But I'm going to read 10 words, much like the participants in the health and retirement study experienced. I will only read each word once. I will not repeat the word list. And as soon as I have completed reading the list of 10 words, then you will have an opportunity to write down as many as you can. I will not ask any of you how many you got. I will not ask if they were correct or incorrect words. This is simply so you can understand the task a little bit better. Are you ready to begin? Okay, no one's writing yet? Good. Tree. Book. Market. Bridge. Child. Gold. King. Bag. Garden. Cup. You may begin writing as many as you can remember. Okay, so that is the immediate word recall task in the health and retirement study. Then in the study, interviewers go on to ask a few different questions, and then a few minutes later, we'll say, now about that word list that I read to you, now I'd like you to recall as many as you can, and the participant needs to repeat the words back. Not surprisingly, participants tend to do better right after hearing the word list compared to after they've had their working memory exhausted with answering other questions. And then we simply calculate the total number of correct words between the immediate list and the delayed list and get some number that's between 0 and 20 words. This is the list of the mental work demands items that are in the Occupational Information Network. Just due to time, I'm going to move quickly past this, but I shared the slides with Silky, and if anyone would like a copy of the presentation, I'm happy to share it. So this is what we get from our data. This is a plot of 100 random participants out of the 4,182. The fact that you see a bunch of dots all over the place shows that there is some noise in the data. We don't have clean patterns, but we did calculate a best fit line to look at the pattern. And we conducted the analysis using latent growth curve modeling, looking at each opportunity to observe individuals over time, where over, roughly speaking, I think we had about 7 waves of data when we completed the analysis. I don't remember exactly. I'd have to go back. The paper was published in 2014. So truthfully, we did this about 6 or 7 years ago, and a few of the details are not stuck in my own memory. But what we have is a line. The black solid line are those participants who were 1 standard deviation above the mean in job complexity. And the dotted line below that is individuals 1 standard deviation below that. And the middle of the graph, I don't know if this is, okay, so right here in the middle is considered the retirement point. Given that these were individuals who joined the study in 1992, many of them fit a more traditional retirement pattern of working and then stopping work and then retiring. So in this particular case, we thought that modeling the data that way made sense. And so we look from time prior to retirement and then cognitive functioning at retirement and then years from retirement, where the data were staggered and set up based on pivoting from retirement. And the fact that the 2 lines don't cross at any point shows that on average, individuals in higher, more complex jobs did perform statistically better in cognitive functioning compared to those who didn't. But as you can see, the lines are fairly close together. And so as a result, the difference between those in high and those in lower complexity jobs was not all that great. It was roughly on average a little bit more than the difference of 1 word per wave over the time period of observation. So remembering, 18 instead of 19 or 11 instead of 10. And we do see, so we did confirm our hypothesis that those who were in more complex jobs were a little bit better off than those who weren't, even after controlling for years of education, socioeconomic status, and health, which are the other variables that we know are typically related to cognition. So we don't think this is just an education effect. From a research standpoint, it would be great if we could just randomly assign people to jobs and then see what happens. But ethically, unfortunately, that would not be so good. We just can't do that. The other thing we found is that those in complex jobs did decline at a slightly slower rate. It's difficult to tell from this particular graph. But this black line is not quite as steep as this dotted line. Again, the effect sizes are relatively small, so we're not talking about sweeping differences, but they were significant. It was a large sample, but we think that there were some degree of meaningful differences. So what does all of this mean? It means that characteristics of our job, the way our jobs are structured, and in this particular case with regard to work design and more complex work, that being engaged in work that is cognitively demanding is associated with better functioning later in life. So my guess is all of you, even just being here today, regardless of your jobs, your interest in engaging cognitively says something good about your well-being, hopefully later in life. and especially for those who are engaged in more complex jobs, so anyone in research or academia, our jobs tend to fit these characteristics for sure. So the implications of this is to design work so that it is cognitively engaging. Being involved in jobs where we're using our brain and engaging in new things, problem solving, stimulating activities is good, so that we can both maintain jobs as well as task complexity. And then in turn, this is good for health and well-being at work. Many workers enjoy having jobs with task variety and complexity, and to the extent that we can protect our cognitive functioning, that also is good overall. And so what we learned from this is really that paying attention to the characteristics of the work in which we're engaged over our career does have implications for our cognitive functioning, and it does have implications for our well-being, not only during the time leading up to retirement, but in this particular case, we looked at up to 10 years post-retirement and see that that has a carryover effect in a positive way. So now I'm going to move on and talk about a concept called workability, which refers to our job-related functional capacity. So it's not workability in the traditional job performance capacity that industrial organizational psychologists often speak, but rather when you have a job that you're expected to do, what is your perception that you can meet those demands, meet those expectations, and accomplish that work? And this is important for understanding mature workforce issues, health and retirement, because it's our perceptions of our work environment and whether people perceive that they can do what's expected of them that is important. And we know from past research that on the positive side, workability is related to our subjective well-being and life satisfaction. And on the negative side, it's related to things like absenteeism and long-term sick leave, as well as retirement. In other words, people who perceive that they can't meet what's required of them at work are more likely to miss work, to take long-term sick leave, and to retire sooner than those who have higher workability. It's also related to disability leave. So from a theoretical standpoint, we rely upon the job demands resources model, which I think of as this, what we refer to in the United States as a seesaw. I don't know if you have a different term. Is there a different term for it here? Same, okay. And so as job demands go up, what we need are resources to meet those demands. If job demands exceed resources, that means that workers often struggle with regard to workability. And so what we want are resources to meet those demands, if not to have resources that will exceed those demands. And the job demands resources model was originally developed to predict burnout, fatigue, and exhaustion in the work environment, but has since been used to investigate a number of other issues with regard to health and well-being. So generally speaking, if we can increase resources and reduce demands, we can balance things out in a way that's beneficial for workers' health and well-being. Another approach is the notion of person-environment fit, which is about as intuitive as the term implies, that we want to maximize the extent to which a particular worker is a good match for the tasks and the job that they're hired to do, as well as we can think of this more broadly on an organizational level, to have a good fit with the culture and the norms and the expectations of a particular company or organization. In this particular study, for which the lead author was my colleague and friend, Dr. Alyssa McGonigal, we investigated a lot of job demands and job resources, as well as personal resources, to investigate the extent to which they predict perceived workability, and then in turn lead to absence, disability, and retirement. And I don't know if you can read the tiny print there. Okay. So a number of different job demands, or what we might conceptualize as potential sources of stress in the work environment, having too much work to do, time pressure, and so forth. Resources, we look a lot at autonomy and social support from coworkers and supervisors. And then personal resources include a couple measures of health status, overall sense of control, as well as some personality traits like positive affectivity, conscientiousness, and emotional stability. And then we looked at the interaction of these resources and demands as well. We use data from the health and retirement study for this as well. In testing our mediated model, we did use data across 3 different points in time, and we looked at work characteristics to assess job demands and job resources by linking data to the occupational level and bringing in data from ONET once again, because unfortunately we didn't have measures of job demands and job resources in the health and retirement study in the primary data on the employment section. We used relative weights analysis for our statistical analysis simply because we thought that, and we knew from looking at the data, that the job demands and job resources are highly intercorrelated with one another, and that multicollinearity in the data would lead to difficulty in looking at the predictions in our model, and so using relative weights analysis was a way around that issue with that high degree of intercorrelation among those variables. In this particular study, we examined data from 2,335 individuals age 51 and older who participated in the 2008 wave of the health and retirement study, simply because that's when we measured workability and had those data available. And they needed to be working for pay at the time of their study. So at the time of the study. So if they had already retired or otherwise not been working, or if they were unemployed and looking for work, they didn't answer the questions about perceived workability and simply then were not available. So on average, almost 64 years of age. And then we were able to follow those people forward to investigate disability leave and eventual retirement. So slightly higher proportion of females than males, but still roughly about equal. This is our measure of workability. It was 4 items that are highly intercorrelated and unidimensional with a, I can't remember the coefficient alpha. I believe it's at least, it's above 0.8 for these 4 items. And people were asked, well, can you all read that up there? Okay, I'll give you a moment to just see what the question is. So in this measure of workability, we differentiate, so we ask about overall current workability as well as workability for physical job demands, mental demands, and also the interpersonal demands of the job, although individuals rated those pretty similarly. Excuse me, and where you see the red asterisks is where we found statistically significant predictors in our relative weights analysis. In other words, we found that role overload, role conflict, physical demands of work, unfavorable body positions, autonomy, an overall higher level health status, overall self-rated health, sense of control, positive affectivity, and conscientiousness were all statistically significant predictors of perceived workability. And in turn, perceived workability did predict absenteeism, disability leave, and retirement when we looked 2 and 4 years later. I don't have the specific coefficients and statistics available on the slide. I tried to just simplify it with a simple graphic here, but if anyone's interested in the full details, I'm happy to share the paper with you. So what this means is that our personal and job-related characteristics do predict our workability, so our perceptions of our functional capacity and ability to meet the demands of what's expected of us at work are related to both the characteristics of our job as well as some of our own personal resources. And then we still need more research just so we can better understand the personal resources, and to figure out if you need, we know that autonomy is beneficial, but how much autonomy do we need to find those effects? In other words, we didn't look here at curvilinear effects or go into much more depth with that. And also from a work design standpoint, what can we do to design jobs to make them more autonomous, to give people more resources, to provide more support, and so forth. We know that these things are beneficial, but what we know less about is how much do we need and what exactly can we do to do that. there's a bit, let me back up. There's a bit that we know, but it still leaves questions so that we can tease it apart at a more finite level, if that makes sense. Okay. So the last study for which I'm going to share some data investigate a little bit more in terms of the job demands. So it takes, in essence, the prior two studies and looks a little bit more about what's expected of individuals at work and how individuals function on a cognitive basis, and then looks to predict both retirement and health from that. So if we have what's expected, and then we have one aspect of our functioning, which is our cognitive functioning, how, when we look at what's expected and our own abilities, does it relate to outcomes? And again, this is based on a perspective of person-job fit, emphasizing the notion that the more the person fits what's expected, the better off they'll be. And so looking at person-job fit as well as a broader person-environment fit, just different researchers who looked about these things differently. So for this, we used a different data set. It was a validation study of cognitive abilities. It has much, much richer, detailed cognitive measures compared to some of the more simple tasks like what we have in the health and retirement study with the immediate and delayed word recall task. So in some waves of this, it was 7 waves of the study, but there were some in which we had 3 hours of cognitive testing, and we had quite a rich array, and we were able to look across a number of abilities. And we did a factor analysis of those abilities, and for this study selected 13 different abilities to assess reasoning as well as to assess knowledge. So thinking back to the earlier part of the presentation when I talked about fluid and crystallized abilities, we can think of knowledge abilities as an indicator of crystallized intelligence, and then reasoning abilities as an indicator of fluid intelligence, and so that we can look and see with regard to what's required of us at work, do we see different patterns for what happens if we look at knowledge, which we don't think declines over time as quickly, if at all, or reasoning, which we know that as people get older, we tend to lose those abilities to some degree. And so we looked, in essence, at the congruence between what's expected of the job and what abilities the person has. And then we looked at that in relation to chronic health. And analytically, we used polynomial regression and response surface methodology that gives us this pretty fancy chart. Kudos to Jackie Torres, a graduate student at Rice University in Texas in the United States, who did the analysis for us. So what we have here on the left top is knowledge ability. On the right top is knowledge demands. And then we have the number of chronic health conditions, things like it's a count of whether people experience health conditions like hypertension, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, and so forth. And based on the notion that having more chronic health conditions means being less healthy. And what this graph shows is that as the agreement or the congruence between our workers' abilities and their demands, as that congruence got lower, then people experience more chronic health conditions. Does that make sense? So in other words, it is some statistical evidence that for the notion of person-environment fit, that as people's abilities and demands were not consistent, was also related to being in worse health. And then we also looked at this for reasoning ability and reasoning demands in relation to chronic health. And here you can see that that it's particularly, the effect sizes were even stronger, that when the ability and the demands were not met, especially on when ability was much lower, people experienced much higher chronic health conditions. And I don't have the graphs here to show what this looks like with regard to retirement, but we found a similar pattern, such that as that degree of congruence, the more incongruent things were, the more likely people were to leave the workforce and to retire. So what does this mean? That as workers experience an incongruence between what's expected and their ability to function, they're also, I want to be clear, I'm not inferring causation here, but we see that they're also in worse health and more likely to leave the workforce. And so when reasoning abilities required by a job exceeded workers' abilities, they also reported more health conditions and they were more likely to be retired. It could be that these reasoning abilities were declining as a result of health. It could also be that health was declining. It's difficult to say what the chicken is and what the egg is here in terms of what comes first and what comes second, simply that we observe these patterns. But this is one of the first studies where we objectively measure person-environment fit. So we're not just asking about somebody's work ability. We're separately testing cognitive abilities and then looking at what ONET says is required to correctly perform these jobs. And in fact, this is what we observe. So what does all this mean for older adults? There are many benefits to continuing to work. As I indicated at the beginning of the presentation, there are economic benefits to continuing to work, particularly with regard to income and wages. And depending on the country where you work and the environment, there may be other economic benefits in terms of retirement contributions to a superannuation or to a retirement fund or to healthcare benefits and so forth. Continuing to work usually, we hope, offers some degree of cognitive activity. Some maybe more so than others if it's cognitively complex work. But generally speaking, we're thinking and problem solving in all jobs just about every day in some capacity. Hopefully we're in jobs that provide a source of well-being. It's a place that we want to go, that we can get social support, engage in productive social relationships. And for many people, work is an important source of identity. It's how we identify who we are as people. And it serves a sense of meaningfulness and a purpose in life. That said, there are some negative associations of continuing to work, particularly if we're in jobs that are characterized, let me see, is that all? Yep, that's all of them. If we're in jobs where we feel locked in and individuals are perceiving that they're working because they have to rather than because they want to, then that's not going to be a good situation, and that's associated with some harmful psychological effects. Sometimes work can lead to burnout, feeling emotionally exhausted or fatigued due to our work. There's a stream of research that some of my colleagues are doing looking at when people involved in meaningful work, and when that meaningfulness is really, really high, are they more likely to get burned out simply because they get so invested that they tend to overwork and then are more likely to burn out? So they're looking at that among veterinarians and other people who are just particularly passionate about the people they work with. I know this can happen in nursing and other areas as well, you know, when people are caring for others and deeply invested, but it can be exhausting. There are jobs with where people are prone to injuries. Just today, walking around the city, we saw some window washers that were suspended from a crane at the top of one of the tall buildings washing the windows. And my son said, "Wow, look at that." And he said, "That's a job I would never want to have." And it was just, he self-selected out of that one right then and there. And as his mom, I was kind of grateful. May you please choose a job where you will be safe. Age discrimination, unfortunately, it exists. There are laws that are often put in place to preclude them, but we know from a whole host of research in organizational psychology that unfortunately it exists. And then there's a notion of job security and unemployment, and meta-analyses that show that older workers who become unemployed are going to have a more difficult time finding employment compared to younger workers, which is quite unfortunate. So what are the implications? What does all of this mean? There are implications for job design. Designing jobs, structuring work in ways where we can increase the meaningfulness, increase the complexity, increase all of the positive, beneficial characteristics of our job, but at the same time try and avoid some of the negative things. We know giving people autonomy, some say over what they're doing and how they're doing it, can be quite beneficial. Social support and productive, positive relationships with others can be really beneficial. there's a growing body of research pointing to job crafting, in which giving workers some say over letting them design and structure their jobs and figure things out on their own, or pick and choose things that works really well for them, is terrific. I have a colleague who's not really detail oriented, and so she'll delegate some of those tasks to me, and then there are some other tasks that are not my favorites, and so I'll delegate those to her, and it works pretty well that we can each focus on some of the tasks that we enjoy and offload the others. We've seen some evidence here today about the importance of person-job and person-environment fit and what that looks like with regard to health and well-being, and recognizing that increasing resources like autonomy and support can be beneficial for workers. We need to be aware of and also recognize that people themselves do change over time. Somebody may be healthy one day and then experience a health shock or a negative health event and not be healthy the next. Or it could be a gradual decline in health from which people don't recover quickly. Individuals may change cognitively over time and lose their functioning. Some of the work that I got involved in doing came about because one of my colleagues, who's a counseling psychologist, had a patient who was the CFO of a particular company, the chief financial officer, and admitted that he was declining in cognitive functioning and really couldn't keep up with his job anymore. And so as a result, he knew that he needed to retire and he could no longer do that work. And so just recognizing that as people's abilities change over time, there may be a necessity to shift what's happening with jobs. So just to wrap up, there are a number of future research needs, a number of things that we need to do. One is to develop interventions that are age-friendly, so certainly suitable for an aging workforce. But what we know from this literature and this work up until this point is that if it's beneficial for middle-age or older workers, then it's beneficial for all workers. There isn't much that we would put in place for older adults that wouldn't benefit everybody. Making sure signage is easy to read, making sure that information is presented in a clear way. I mean, there's just the ways in which we go about designing training programs. So many of these things really just benefit everybody. We want to also recognize how work stress affects cognitive functioning. Marty Slewinski and Rob Stosky and some folks at Penn State and other places have started to look at just simply the relation between stress and cognition, and we know that stress is bad for cognition, but there hasn't been much research done specifically on work stress, and so understanding that process would also be helpful. What we don't know is when people are experiencing cognitive decline and they're struggling to keep up with their job demands, is it better for that person to leave and go to a new job in a new environment that's less demanding, or stay in the same organization, maybe even the same job, but reduce the scope of work, reduce the tasks, or reduce work hours? I would argue that it may depend on the job. For example, the CFO who had declined in cognitive functioning to the point that he couldn't keep up with the books. I mean, maybe fewer work hours wasn't going to fix that problem, but maybe he could mentor or train somebody else or share some knowledge and experience in a very generative kind of way. We know that generativity can often be motivating and fulfilling. And that might in fact be easier than moving to a completely new environment, because if somebody is struggling to acquire and synthesize new information, going to a new environment may create a whole host of other problems. But we simply don't know what's best for people as they're struggling, yet wanting to remain socially engaged and knowing that engagement is beneficial for individuals. And also knowing that, again, ethically, we can't randomly assign people to these groups and what to do. But knowing what do we do with people and how can we help manage this from a human resource standpoint, from a vocational counseling standpoint, there are some challenges yet ahead. And related to all of this, what can we do to reduce negative age stereotypes? I don't want anyone to walk out of here and think, oh, it's all downhill and, forget those older workers because there are all these problems. There's a lot that older workers contribute in a positive way to the work environment in terms of knowledge, experience. There are a number of characteristics that are perceived as being really beneficial, and many companies are suffering because expertise is leaving when people leave. There's an institutional knowledge, a source of mentoring, and a source of generativity that when people retire also goes with them. And so there are many benefits, not only for the individuals themselves to stay in the workforce, but also for the place where they work to retain them. And we need to manage and hopefully reduce these age stereotypes. So Gigi Petrie, who's a CEPAR researcher, our colleague in Perth, is doing a number of projects related to perceptions of people in multiple age groups, but also with older adults and age stereotypes. And hopefully her work will help shed some light on this, especially with regard to performance. So we can look at job design and job crafting, and just a little bit of what I'm doing with regard to CEPAR work and with others on Sharon Parker's team. I'm writing a review paper for Academy of Management Annals along with Sharon and her research fellow MK Ward, in which we're merging the work design research and the cognitive functioning and cognitive aging research to really try and understand and unpack what are the mechanisms, what's happening in the brain and cognitively, and to really think about complexity and and autonomy and what is it about those jobs that we think is beneficial and what's really happening. Then again, work with Gigi Petrie on age stereotypes, and then hopefully some future work looking at work characteristics and well-being broadly. And going forward, I would welcome an opportunity to look at some of the data from Hilda and health and aging here in Australia, and look at that in relation to what we know from the health and retirement study in the United States, and see where there are similarities and where there are differences. So thank you so much for bearing with me and for your time and attention.